Okay, welcome everyone to the second panel of the Performing Identities program. I'm delighted to have here with me Luca Pinto, who's curator at Kunsthalle Wien, and Thorne, director at Nottingham Contemporary, and Lucia Pietroiusti, who's curator of live programs and general ecology, a project that she will be talking about in a few minutes at the Serpentine galleries in London. The panel explores another aspect of the performing identities. The first panel was digging into the performance aspect as looking at performance as a sort of research endeavor, and this panel actually unfolds another questions that I've been kind of interested in. So how institutions perform their identities through their exhibition and through the public programs that they conduct. So I gather people together that have not worked directly with performance, but that have pursued projects that have shaped in a way the identity of the institution and the context in which they somehow operate, and that have tried to push the boundaries of conceiving exhibition making in a different from a different research approach, but also practice-based approach. So I think I've been very much interested in this idea on how you can play as a curator within your own institution, and how you can also shift roles, in not only by presenting something, but by interacting, by somehow sort of playing with the notion of exhibiting and inhabiting roles. So when I thought about inviting you, Luca, I thought about one exhibition that you have curated at Kunsthalle Wien, which is 101 and 100,000. And in this exhibition, you created some sort of play in which you asked or you invited the visitor to be some sort of, to embrace the role of the curator in a way, or to maybe like inhabit a sort of hybrid role. And then other projects that you have done with Pierre Bismuth, or now recently a project that you have done with Olaf Nicolai, you have all the time constantly shift, play and research with the medium of presenting and exhibiting. So I'll give you the word. Maybe you can add some reflection on this.
Thank you. So does it work? No?
Yeah.
So this exhibition 101 100,000 that you just mentioned was a show that I curated at the Kunsthalle, I think was 2 or 3 years ago. And the Kunsthalle in Vienna is a non-collecting institution, and has 2 different spaces. One which is the measure space in the museums quartier, which is this sort of prism. I see a bit of different museums and institutions, and then there is this other space which is the glass pavilion, which formerly was a more kind of container look like, and which for me is a sort of rehearsing kind of space. It's in a very sort of visible square, prominent square in Vienna, in front of the Secession, and even if it's quite visible, then you don't have really like a big number of visitors, and since also now this storytelling around institutions, especially from the media, is always around these visitor numbers and so on, I thought to develop a project that could question different notions connected to exhibition making, to exploring the question of spectatorship, authorship, power structures, and trying to set in motion, the different players that of the art discourse, including the institution and also, of course, the context of the city. So the exhibition was loosely inspired by a book by a French writer, Raymond Queneau, that together with Perec, François Lyonnais was part and founders of this Oulipo, French literary group, and was really about exploring the potentiality of literature as a medium, and in this occasion was really doing the same with exhibition. And so I invited, the book by Queneau, it's called 100,000 billion poems, and is a book made of 14 sonnets, each one made of 10 lines, and the book is made of distributed lines that you can recombine, and at the end you can obtain these 100 billion poems. So in a way, I had in mind also Marcel Bruder's motto that every exhibition is just one possibility among many others that were to be explored, and I also really another sort of influence was an exhibition made by Robert Morris in 1969 at Leo Castelli Warehouse, which is continuously altered daily, where it was for 20 days every morning changing the exhibition, and 1 year after Yvonne Reiner then did also this sort of workshop inspired by Maurice Shaw. As well, I think different experiment of post-conceptual, even if this definition is very stupid, or kind of dance positions like Jérôme Bell was a really key element for this. And so in the space, what you see, I invited 9 artists to produce new works, and the idea is that for the opening I installed the exhibition. The day after, the works were deinstalled and were put on the floors, and then every visitor had the possibility of doing a different variation of the exhibition. So they were not forced. It was not really, actually it was also quite against the idea of workshop, and it was not really also we are all the same, we can do. It was a bit against the expectation, especially of the educational team that were very excited of doing a big laboratory. But more involving the audience more as accomplices than voyeurs in a way. And also the works were not only objects, even if the majority of them were objects, and this was also important for me, not having only sort of conceptual works, so it was not really this sort of do-it sort of exhibition but so you have, this is a piece by Lina Vistegroli. The work consisted of 4 wooden letters on wheels, and you can create by moving these letters different range of expressions like ha, or ha, or whatever. And then you have Jason Dodge. The piece is basically like trash litter that Jason collected during his travels. It's a sort of ongoing piece, and these fluffy hammers by Marley Moon also were very heavy. And then you have this, what you see here is, for example, a piece by Darren Bader, and the title was NE8 with NE12, and was up to you how to realize this piece. So you can think about that, you can make it, so it was sort of very open. And for me was when it was also questioning the status of a work. So is this already exhibition when you have the pieces like this? Or this, what is the, this sort of in-between status from being sort of raw material on the floor and then being something else, and of course mirroring also the audience of the city in a way. And so the idea is also that there were not sort of limits in terms of time, so you have people being there for also 4 hours, or like for a moment. So it would be, when I say mirroring the audience, because for some people really took it seriously and spending time, others just they did a sort of Melzbau, creating a pile. Every person could really enter, taking the works also physically, and we arranged it, and then there was the visitor service take a Polaroid, which was creating a sort of ongoing visual diary, also in order to give to the future, like sort of curator, a possibility of seeing what happened before. And so was really also thinking of treating the exhibition as a sort of living body, but in a real sense, and also the project also originated from a sort of frustration of sometimes when you work in institutions where, especially now where there is a strong interest towards time-based art performances, they're all very happy theoretically, but then they're only, very often they're happy when you have works with a performative element, but within a certain sort of structure, very easy to, to control. Here instead I wanted to activate the process, which me also, in the first instance, I didn't know what could have happened. And so it was not a sort of planned improvisation, even if, of course, the whole idea of Ulipo, for example, was combining rules and improvisation. So there was a certain set, like 9 artists, that specific space, and a few others. But was really also thinking about expectations that you have in terms of within the institution, also outside, and also, of course, created a very different sort of reactions, because some of them really criticize it being instead a very sort of giving too much visibility to the curator, to the role of the curator. Other instead thinking about basically economy, labor, say why we have to work and do things, and and then at the end of the exhibition we produce a book with the different variations, but and not only with variations but also images of the space with the works like this. So and since the space, as you can maybe see, is a glass pavilion, this is like some spreads from the book, and with the name of the different people that they decided to do it, including the artists. So since it's a glass pavilion, for me the idea of seeing and being seen was also very a key element. So yeah, is I don't know if it fits into your idea of identities, or in a way was dealing more the idea of politics of exhibition, and and of course was really responding to the identity of this very specific, institution where, like many Kunsthalles, they self-proclaim like being a sort of progressive and experimental institution. So I thought, okay, let's do something that for me was trying to test or these kind of boundaries, and was also dealing with the idea of having a possible failure. Like for example, the press office at the time was really asking constantly, but what happens if we have no one is doing it, or how should we do with the images, because I need certain. So then affected all the idea of how to document an exhibition that is really changing, constantly, or so on. But the end was very simple, but at least I really wanted to share with the audience certain problematics that I feel very often.
I think it's thanks Sam for sharing this, and to me it resonates in the kind of thinking and researching about the question of questioning the status of an exhibition, embracing literature, and some sort of like basically taking literature as a starting point for your project, and bringing it into a format that is completely different from a book in a way, and for me that's the project is quite interesting, and it connects to what we also were discussing yesterday with Lucia. But we are all dealing with a format which is the exhibition format, or the creation of an event, and where we also gather in performances. But in a way, as a format, it's an old format. It's some sort of like we as curators and researchers and as artists, we always feel some sort of tied in this way of exhibiting and presenting. So your was a sort of was an interesting project, and still is an interesting project, of course, because it kind of responds to this kind of frustration. How do I push the boundaries of the practice that I'm doing? And I think I would like somehow introduce the project that Lucia is dealing with at the Serpentine Galleries in London, and it's a project that she proposed and she created, and now she's going to direct it for I guess for the next years. So and the project is called General Ecology Project, and conceive the institution as a sort of ecosystem in a way, which is sort of unsustainable, or which deals with issues that shows the unsustainability of a certain way of operating. So how do we deal with it? How do we want the institution to be sustainable in a way, and also this kind of format, or should we arrive to some sort of like this not break, but some sort of catastrophic events that then like really push us the question, how should I operate differently in a way, so not to make a difference, but in a way to be consistent and contingent to the time in which we live and in which we also operate. So maybe I pass the word.
Thank you. Thank you. When you said catastrophic event, I was thinking, maybe a catastrophic event in the art world would be quite a funny thing to see, but no, not in the wider ecosystem. If you want to play this with no sound, it will feel more like a guided. You can turn it off. It will feel more like a guided meditation. I worked as curator of public programs at the time, and we called it public programs at the Serpentine Galleries since 2013. and that was in a similar way to what you actually, in fact, both described, Daniel and Manuel, a kind of a kind of hybrid role that produced hybrid things between conferences, discourse, time-based events, film commissions, performance programs, and the yearly Serpentine Marathon, which is this kind of festival that brings together all the disciplines around a particular theme or topic, moving quite fast through those, because my role since the beginning of the year has shifted somewhat more towards something like this, and the development of a project, which I should probably say is developed together with a number of other individuals within, but particularly outside of the organization, that we're kind of temporarily calling general ecologies, and there's a shout out to the BBC for making a beautiful film, and that comes out of, I don't know if you've come across, there's a recent very good edited collection of essays called General Ecology, edited by Eric Hurl, that it brings back a kind of notion of an ecological notion that I suppose Gregory Bates and Felix Guattari would have already had, that of ecologies thought in a wider understanding and also societal understanding. They speak about the ecology of society, of mind, and of the environment. And I reflected on what that would mean in the context of an institution, and how to transition a role that is more to do with kind of the discourse and the live into something that is a little bit more that is that and a few other things. So I was thinking about ecology as a topic, but also the ecology of practices and really souls and beings within an institution itself, and that across different institutions and organizations and groups and the ways in which they relate to each other. And I thought about, well, what would be a role that would look at those three things simultaneously? So something like embed an ecological worldview into every single facet of an institutional practice. And some of those are going to be visible, and some of those might not. What does that actually mean? I hope to very quickly talk about. If you want to go to my... Oh no, I have a thing here. Do I have a thing here? So one of the ideas of the General Ecology Project is that it will embed certain notions around interspecies questions, climate change questions, critical questions around complexity, decolonial questions around sort of critical decolonial reflections, queer questions, and lots of other sort of intersectional and incredibly complex things, but understood from a systems or cybernetic kind of perspective, or an ecological rather perspective, into the other things that we do. So how do we weave a narrative that is a little bit longer than the length of an event, or the length of an exhibition, or even of a series, or even of a business plan for an institution which is roughly 35 years long? How do we weave a narrative that is a little bit longer than that, and think about the notion of deep time into, or geological time into, the things that we do? How do we narrate a story that pulls certain threads out of all the other things that we do, even if those things don't necessarily connect to one another directly, and have a kind of substratum of research and practice, let's say, underneath all of those things? And again, to get even more practical, some of those things might include hacking, as it were, certain existing formats and things that we already do. For example, the Marathon Festival this year is on the subject of work. You would kind of think, well, what does work and ecology have anything to do with one another? Well, you could think about, for example, post-human or non-human labor. You could think about sex robots having rights. You could think about mushrooms cleaning up the earth as a way of sort of learning from Silvia Federici and wages for housework and translating it into wages for mushrooms, and what would it mean? And, you know, picking up on all the rights of nature kind of questions. Or you could reflect on reproductive work, antinatalism, things, the ways in which certain forms of kind of activisms meet with certain forms of labor, activisms around the environment meet with certain kinds of labor activism. And to do that, we've created a series of podcasts which are conversations around the topic of work that will precede and then follow the marathon itself. and each one of those is done in collaboration, so you can see with other organizations. So you can see 2 of those 3 ecologies that I mentioned before are being, let's say, activated in this kind of context. This is the work of mushrooms. If you've seen Phantom Thread, then you know what this is about. But when I was thinking about the labor of mushrooms, you should watch this movie because it's great. The other ecology, the one intra-organizational, so the one that happens within the institution, what I mean by that is how can one prototype certain roles of curatorial roles that cut across the different silos of that really are defined by sort of 19th century museum history, exhibition, education, even fundraising, finance, marketing, what have you. How can you have a prototype of a role that kind of works in a much more fluid way across all those things? So for example, and I'm finding myself working a lot more with, in this role with other departments that I haven't had an enormous amount of dealings with, except for this kind of curatorial role where you normally you give the project or the program or the list of great names to the development department that then goes off and fundraises, tells you how much they've fundraised, and then you kind of receive it. But more things like how can one work with the development department to develop microeconomic structures for each kind of project that you want to do by working in collaborations with other organizations and within. So that's what I meant. Little parenthesis about intra. So we had just to make one example that I'm going to just very quickly whiz through. There was an exhibition of the works of Ian Chang at the Serpentine earlier this year. And for that work, we can actually stick with this one. For that work, for that exhibition, Ian Chang created an artificial intelligence called Bob that had its own life manifested in several different screens, and who would interact with its environment, which was in this instance perceived through different sensors on phones, and interact with its audience, but not so much as an, let's say, Xbox kind of interaction piece of kind of game, but more as a being. So coded within Bob's soul, let's say, were parameters and algorithms that would make it so that Bob may have a completely independent relationship to its audience as well. And so really we were talking a lot more about something on the confines with animal studies when talking about this artificial intelligence. And because of that, I joined forces with the editor and curator Filipa Ramos, who is encyclopedic in her knowledge of animal studies, and we decided, and the relationship with art, amongst many other things that she's encyclopedic about. But we decided to curate a symposium, which we called The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish, recall, in honor of the great pufferfish crop circles. We were thinking about sort of where that circle exists before that fish kind of shuffles around and makes that shape, whether it is conceived as an entire sort of thing, and whether really it is what David Attenborough says in that sound that I muted for a reason, which is that it's all about sort of, reproduction and attracting a mate, or whether we could think about notions, as you said, Daniel, of performance, notions of art making, notions of kind of expanded consciousness or something like this through it. And we made a symposium at the London Zoo. This is another shape of a circle in the mind of in extraterrestrial being, in Arrival. So we made a symposium called that, the first part of which is at the London Zoo, but I should say that this symposium is 1.5 years long and is going to take place over 5 or 6 parts. And what the symposium is doing, very briefly, is stuff in interspecies landscapes. So thinking about consciousness across animal, non-human animal, human and artificial beings on a continuum by looking at it from lots of different perspectives. So the first part, this is Claire Filmont performing Simone Forti in the reptile house of the zoo. The first part was connected with language and communication and how to think of an interspecies communications. This is Peter Gabriel improvising music with bonobos. Let me tell you that bonobos are really good. This is a piece of work by Italian artist Michela De Mattei. Can you play this with sound? Just a few seconds of it, and then we'll see. where she, Michela De Mattei, the artist, had a year of conversations on Skype with a myna bird was opening and things like this, so has a very special relationship with the space within which it finds itself and the sound. This is a 5-minute piece, and the dancer just spins around in circle continuously. So again, lots of different ways of exploring different forms of possible communications across species. Arrival was based on a short story called Story of Your Life that was written by Ted Chiang, and which Ted Chiang did join us to talk about what in his mind was the difference between language and all these other things. You can just skip to the next one. Thank you. It goes on and on and on. It's quite... we had 3 of these videos, the last one of which was a meditation session, in which she tried to hypnotize the poor myna bird, who, anyway, didn't end up hypnotized, so it's fine. And then moving swiftly on. So part 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 of the Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish will be happening at the zoo, at lots of other partners, places, possibly abroad. We're kind of bringing it as a traveling suitcase of ideas and research. And for the second one, Philippa and I are thinking about interior multitude and Gaia theory. So things like we've never been a single individual. So in terms of the, when you were talking about identity, we were thinking about individuality. And how can we think about the revolutions in biology in the sort of later part of the 20th century that posit that competition and individualism are actually much less prominent than symbiosis and coevolution and cooperation, and how can we think about those things and scale them up from gut, this is gut bacteria, and think about the fact that, for example, our gut bacteria and the well-being of our gut bacteria makes it such that we cannot think of ourselves as the individual driven by the thing that we call rational consciousness alone, and therefore, and how can we scale this up to thinking about organisms that operate as one, hence Gaia theory. I'm really obviously making a massive shortening of all of this. And I should say that that one is taking place at the same time as Pietroiusti's exhibition. So again, returning to this idea of how do you take or interpret or read an exhibition. Of course, Pietroiusti has a great engagement with ecological thinking, but how can you then sort of bring one program from an exhibition season to another and continue to tell the kind of same story but from a different standpoint. So this is a piece by Pietroiusti, and it's just for me to tell you that part 3 is going to have to do with a kind of speculative proposal for an interspecies commons and the idea of space and scale and how big does a cell know how to grow and so on and so forth. And that the exhibition in the spring will be Emma Kuntz, who used to use magnetism and her practice as a mystic and medium to make daffodils that have been studied and are genetically coded to have one head. She would use magnetism to make them grow up to 12 heads, and then the row afterwards 9 heads, and then 7, and so on. And so how can we think about this? Starting from Emma Kuntz, we're thinking about the shape of a circle in the mind of a fish around notions of communication with non-animate beings and forces. And the next one, there's one TV that's going to happen on underwater pressure, for which I don't have an image, from Hollywood. And this last image from Hollywood and last image of my presentation is from Annihilation, which is a film, the end of which is not as good as it is in the book. The book is by Jeff Vandermeer, and that is because the last symposium that we're going to work on is called After the End. It's called The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish, Part 6, After the End of the End, and looks at different forms of post-apocalyptic utopias and ways in which female mysticism, all the way back from medieval times, can give us some kind of ways of thinking about that post time. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucia. Thank you so much. I think I was drawn into 2 of the metaphors that that you were using. One of is a continuation of a narrative, basically through an exhibition program or through a program that goes beyond that research or that explore the way of exhibiting differently in a way, and the notion of the museum or the institution as an ecosystem that somehow has to deal both internally and externally with different sort of ecology, and in a way, in the end, find a sort of equilibrium, which is a temporary equilibrium, of course, but that basically goes from. I would say that each exhibition represents some sort of like the moment in which you break the equilibrium and you kind of reach another sort of status in a way. And that brings me into Sam's practice, because Sam has been director at Saint-Yves and now he's director at Nottingham Contemporary, and as a director you have a different role in a way, because you are the one kind of dealing with this kind of external and internal practice of finding an equilibrium, and also thinking how the institution is placed within the ecology of the art, but also the ecology, so to say, in a larger perspective of the society in which it inhabits. And you have done different projects there, but I think one interesting project that you have recently pursued is the one with Lara Favaretto and also with Linder. Maybe you can just, I was just wondering whether you could maybe elaborate more on one of these two exhibitions, which I think can kind of really drop into.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm going to try to talk a little bit more about ecosystems, but maybe less in the sense of equilibrium and more in the sense of breakdown, like institutional collapse.
That's the catastrophe that
that was my point, exactly.
The catastrophe that you've been waiting for. So yeah, this is Nottingham Contemporary. For those of you who haven't visited, it's one of the largest contemporary art centres in the UK. It's in Nottingham, in the heart of that city. Nottingham is the city that is probably best known for Robin Hood and for its castle. And Robin Hood didn't exist, probably, and the castle itself was burnt down in the mid-19th century following a kind of uprising of the citizens of Nottingham about taxation. So it's this interesting place that has a kind of long history of rebellion or independent thinking, but some of those stories are also based on things that aren't actually immediately apparent. We opened back in 2009 in this building that's designed by Caruso St. John Architects. And what you might be able to just about make out on the facade of the building is that it's actually imprinted with lace. Nottingham has a long history of textile manufacture and in particular lace making. The project that I'm going to talk about is something that we were working on with Lara Favaretto, the Italian artist, over the course of a year or two. When I took over at Nottingham Contemporary in maybe spring 2016, I inherited very little in terms of an exhibitions program, which was both very freeing and somewhat terrifying as well. And Lara Favaretto was one of the first artists who I invited to do a project. When Lara first did her site visit, she was very interested to see the whole of the building, to understand, I suppose, the different strata of the building, because what you can't make out from this image is that it's actually over 3 floors, and it digs right down into a sandstone cliff. The whole of the city is kind of on this system of caves and tunnels. Lara was interested in thinking about this cross-section of the institution. For many years, she had been thinking about this work by Boetti, in fact, one of Boetti's, I think, last works, which is typically translated into English as "my head is smoking," or "my head is on fire." And so, yeah, it's a self-portrait of sorts. It's a bronze sculpture, but inside the head of the artist is fitted filaments that heat up the head. So when this jet of water hits it, it creates a head of steam. And Lara, for many years, had been wanting to transpose this to the logic of the institution, to think about the institution as a head, as a brain, as a kind of a smoking thing, whereby there are so many different thoughts and questions and arguments and debates that it's actually overheating. So she essentially said to me, yes, I'll do the exhibition so long as we can produce this project that nobody has been able to do for the last 10 years. And because I was still new, I thought that we could probably do that. And it was very challenging. We were working from these rough sketches of Lara, which the image on the right, you can kind of see how she was thinking about the cross-section of the building. Our auditorium and performance space is this kind of subterranean bunker-like space that in Lara's reading was very similar to those Cold War era war rooms, the likes that you see in things like Dr. Strangelove. It's a somewhat theatrical space, double height, very raw concrete. And Lara was thinking about this as the kiln or the motor that heats up or animates the institution, with then generating this water pressure, this heating of water that would then become evident in a cloud of steam. So her proposal was essentially that she wanted to create a cloud of steam that would hang over Nottingham Contemporary, not only for the duration of the exhibition, but several months before it and several months afterwards. So not only extending the exhibition space vertically and above the building, but also extending the space time of the exhibition beyond the realm of the 3-month allotted period. Lara's idea was really that this would create a kind of a closed ecosystem, that when this steam was hit by the elements, it would behave differently. So on windy days it would dissipate, on still days it would just hang above the building. So it took a long time to work out how we wanted to do this. We tried lots of different things out, from building, in effect, a hot plate, a large saucepan on the roof of the building that we would then heat water on over the duration of the show. That was going to be wildly expensive, so we couldn't do it. Another idea was to work with people who are typically working with theatres to use dry ice to create something like dry ice that would create this cloud of steam that Lara was looking for. But dry ice drops, and we needed something that rose. So after a lot of research, we found a design studio in Switzerland that actually specialises in these steam machines. They're called water nebulizing devices. And they're the kinds of things that if you've been to a hot place with cafes, they're kind of sometimes used to cool those places down. So we modified a series of these nebulizing devices and spent some time fitting them on the roof of Nottingham Contemporary to produce this effect. So this was on the first day of testing, and what we found was that depending on the atmospheric pressure in the city, this water vapor would either rise or would actually create a very dense Dickensian fog that would subsume the whole of the building, almost making it completely disappear. So from one day to the next, it was highly, highly erratic, and we spent the first few weeks with the fire brigade being called every day because it hadn't somehow occurred to any of us that this steam, which was actually water vapor, could be read as smoke. So yeah, Lara's kind of metaphor of my head smoking was taken somewhat literally by people, but we were able to get through that with a lot of negotiation. So I wanted to introduce this because this is really only one half of the project. The public program for Thinking Head was the other half of this kind of two-faced initiative, and it was a public program of sorts, but it was actually a private program. Lara's proposal was that not only would we create a cloud of steam above the building, but there would be a program of secret roundtable discussions that would take place on a monthly basis in the bunker-like space at the core of the building. And in Lara's logic, or illogic here, it was the density of these conversations that were creating the heat, that were creating this kind of steam. The twist was that these conversations would have no audience. They would be recorded, and I suppose in every kind of sense of the setup for this program, it was going against the more conventional logic of a public program. So they didn't have an audience. They were roundtable discussions between people from different disciplines and different fields. And they were not 1 hour long or 2 hours long, they could be absolutely any length. So to give an example for how each of these were convened, each of the roundtables was discussing a certain term selected by Lara that had some kind of bearing on her work. So one of those was collapse, one was obsolescence, one was opacity. And Lara was very interested for this to be a conversation that went beyond the field of culture or the field of visual arts. So in any given roundtable, there would be people from robotics or waste disposal or a local priest or a lace archivist to bring together these different kinds of knowledges to create not solutions, but as Lara would put it, kind of more and more breakdowns. So it was the role of the convener of each of these roundtables to push the conversation not towards solutions, but towards more and more confusion. So it was a project that I think tried to really break down the usual relations between an exhibition and a public program, whereby the latter is explicating or clarifying the former. Rather, what Lara wanted to do was to push towards more confusion, more obfuscation, more concealment, more breakdown. I think I'll probably leave it there, and I can talk a bit more about the second project if there's time.
I think what you just, the project that you pursued with Lara, it's quite interesting because not only it kind of creates this metaphor of the institution as a human body or as a head, but in a way that is kind of like, of course, collapsing in this sense. But the public program that you created around it demonstrates in a way that the need of also creating an open space for not only discussion, but as we were mentioning before, sharing collectively knowledge in order to actually push boundaries, challenge the way of exhibiting, or even the exhibition space in its time and in its durational time, and also in its spatial. You don't have to see there somehow, because you don't really see, but you experience, and you are kind of part. The exhibition per se is a discussion in a way, and it's a space in which you collectively come together. So I think my as a general question for the three of the speakers, I would maybe ask, how do you see the three of you all work in institutions, of course, and you somehow also feel that there are some limits, and in these limits you feel the need of going beyond those limits. Do you see that a chance? Let's say like this: to say, what's your next step in a way in conceiving your practice within the institution? Do you see that a possibility in some sort of collaborating outside of the institution in order to expand the knowledge and the research of the institution per se, and therefore, coming to the kind of wrapping up for the panel per se, and also rethink the perform a different identity within the institutional context. Complex. Oh no.
I don't know also because what do you mean with institution? Because
yours may be a different context in a way.
In person, I do not have all this faith and beliefs into the role of institutions today. I'm a bit sort of skeptical. We're living in a moment where, due to different reasons, especially for political reasons, especially public-funded institutions, they are obliged to rethink their status. And this is something, on one hand, very negative, but also very positive so under these circumstances, it's not positive because it's, especially like in countries like Germany or Austria. But I think it's a good chance to really thinking from scratch about what it can be, and but of course at the same time it's very generic, this storytelling. We have to rethink the institutions and so on, but I mean already when I see this cloud is a good usually I mean artists are always a sort of good source of inspirations to and what to do, but I just think that for sure having the idea of a static sort of hardware where you have all these elements that constitute institutions, so having press department, marketing, curators, public programs, invite artists and so on, I think it still works for measure like museums, institutions, but I think should really like take the advantage to really delete all this and trying to think in a very different way, which honestly I don't know exactly what can be the solution. I have just raw notes in my mind, but
it's interesting what you were just saying, because I mean I think it's from a collapse that you really have to rethink from scratch what you are somehow doing, or in a way that maybe
already like the project that you should describe, I think is a very interesting way to think that sort of structure, or but since you ask about the institutions, then it's something that I'm thinking even in a more radical way. At the end, we're all talking and describing at the end classical, more or less classical institutions.
Good point. Do you want to have a reflection on this aspect?
I mean, just very briefly, part of me kind of feels like we sort of happen to be talking about art institutions, but I don't necessarily think there's the logic that you use in order for something to exist. There's the kind of way that you narrate a story so that the people that can tell you yes, you can do this, say yes. Then there's the sort of secret kind of bedtime reasons why you're doing something, and the kind of, I don't know, maybe radical politics that you dream about at night. And then there's the kind of, what then you share in a kind of professional sort of, let's share skills and experiences and methodologies kind of questions here. But I don't necessarily think of the project. I suppose I have two things to say about this, connect it with the General Ecology Project. One is that you may never hear that the General Ecology Project is like its own page on the website, or its own exhibition, or it might like disappear. One of the plans for it is for it to be like really disappeared within everything else. And if it's done well, except in moments like here where we're sort of like professionally sharing methodologies again, that project might like appear and disappear as and when it's needed. And then the second thing is I'm really hoping that it, forgetting about sort of you can use the institution as this place from which the resources, the structure to access those resources is already more or less in place, and then you leverage those or somehow point those in some particular direction. But one of the big hopes that I have for the project is actually that eventually we sort of collectively think, like make this smoke, and then at some point in 3 years, 4 years' time, we go, okay, this is the artist-led project in a kind of real-world context that we want to work towards, like whether it's infrastructure or the destruction of infrastructure or some kind of digital but something that And then the project just dissolves. It kind of goes to die at the bottom of the ocean in the shape of some kind of a new fish sanctuary, or God knows, I don't know. But it really sort of goes through the institution rather than be a sort of thing that is owned by it. I don't know if that makes sense, or if it's even going to be true. I don't really know.
Yeah, sure. I mean, something that struck me when you were talking, Lucia, was the ways in which changing up the conventional institutional vocabularies is a big part of any project, of rethinking from within, that you're no longer curator of public programs, but of general ecology, and the hope is there that, as you say, that somehow integrates, it somehow disappears, because everything that the institution is doing is somehow inflected by that. And it seems to me that a lot of the projects, maybe from the last decade, that are trying to think differently about museums are often thinking about the role that language plays in shaping them. I kind of think of something like Tanja Bruguera's project at the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven about 5 years ago, the Museum of Arte Utile, or Useful Arts, which tried to kind of redraw the typical chronologies that we use in art history, not so much thinking about 1945 or whenever it might be, but actually like starting from 1848, thinking about the ways in which the archive might enter into exhibition space differently. But I mean, in one way, all that was doing was switching out one kind of set of, perhaps moribund terms with a kind of something that's more energized. But it does seem to me that, this use of language is pretty critical to this question of what happens next. And then another thought is that, I guess, generationally, we are all people who kind of started to work in institutions after the advent of what came to be known as the new institutionalism, right, in the early mid-2000s, which I guess would typically be defined as bringing curatorial thinking into realms other than exhibition making. So the space of public programs, the space of the archive, etc., etc. But that's now 10 or 15 years ago, and a lot of those kinds of habits and practices have become very, very standardized. And I think that's something that we need to think through and to move past.
Thank you. If there are no questions from the audience, but I will open up the questions from the audience. Then I will thank the speakers and thank the audience for being here and for sharing these interesting thoughts and for presenting or discussing questions that will I think up in the debate within institutional thinking. I am sure about that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.